The night before my wedding, I stood by my bedroom window staring at the reflection of a girl I barely recognized. 27 years old, wearing a satin robe that didn't belong to me. It belonged to the woman my mother wanted me to become. The heir's wife, the company's savior, the good daughter who would trade her heart for balance sheets and profit margins. I remember my hands trembling as I touched the glass, watching the rain blur the lights outside. I whispered to myself, "You'll be fine, Vivian. You always do what you're told." But deep down, a storm had already begun. Growing up, I believed my mother, Eleanor Whitmore, was indestructible. She built Whitmore Interiors from the ground up after my father's sudden death. I was only 12 when he passed, but I remember how she didn't shed a tear at his funeral. She stood tall in her black coat, chin high, and shook hands with investors before the ceremony even ended. "Strength, Vivian," she told me. "That's what keeps this family alive." So I learned to be strong. Or at least, I learned how to pretend. I studied business instead of art. I learned how to smile during meetings I didn't understand. I became her shadow-obedient, polished, and painfully invisible. Everything changed when Whitmore Interiors started collapsing. The housing market crashed, contracts dissolved, and creditors circled like vultures. I remember hearing her on the phone pleading in that calm, authoritative tone that somehow still sounded like a threat. Then came the night she told me about the arrangement. We were sitting in the dining room, the kind of room no one actually eats in mahogany table crystal chandelier. A museum for family portraits and unspoken tension. She poured herself a glass of Chardonnay, her lipstick leaving a perfect crescent on the rim. "Vivian," she said, not looking at me. "Robert Alden has made an offer." I frowned. "For the company? For you?" My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" She exhaled slowly, as if rehearsed. "The Aldens are offering a merger financially and personally. His son Daniel is willing to marry you. If we accept, the deal secures us capital and stability. If we don't, Whitmore Interiors will die." I laughed, though it came out brittle. "You're joking." "Do I look like I'm joking?" I remember her eyes, sharp as broken glass, but desperate in a way I had never seen before. She leaned forward. "You owe me this, Vivian. Everything I've built, our name, your education, our home, it all disappears unless you do your part." "My part?" My voice cracked. "You mean my life?" She didn't flinch. "It's business." That word business became the weapon she used to cut through every protest I had. I wanted to scream that I wasn't a contract, that love shouldn't be collateral. But the guilt was heavier than my pride. I remembered the years she spent alone after Dad died, her sleepless nights, her ambition to keep our name shining when everyone expected her to fail. So I agreed. The wedding was small, but expensive. Everyone smiled like we were the perfect couple, though Daniel barely looked at me. He was handsome with that effortless charm men like him are born knowing how to use, but something in his eyes felt hollow. He kissed me like it was part of a schedule, and by the end of the night, I felt like a signature on a dotted line. For the first few months, I tried to be a good wife. I made polite conversation, arranged dinners, smiled for photographs. But Daniel lived like he was untouchable late nights, mysterious phone calls, whispers of women I never met. When I confronted him, he would smirk and say, "Don't act like you didn't know what this was." I told my mother once that he was cheating on me. She didn't even look surprised. "Keep him happy," she said. "We need this partnership to last." I started to feel like a ghost haunting my own house. Daniel's mansion. Our mansion was full of glass and silence. Every corner echoed with things unsaid. I started sleeping in the guest room just to breathe. But something inside me was changing. Slowly, quietly. I began going to the office, trying to understand what exactly I had sacrificed my life for. Whitmore Interiors looked glamorous from the outside, but inside, it was bleeding. I found unpaid invoices, forged numbers, and a growing dependency on Alden funding. And then, one afternoon, while searching through my mother's old files, I found something that made my heart stop. A series of transfers, large sums of money, moved quietly from Whitmore Interiors to a shell company under Daniel's name. Dates lined up perfectly with our wedding and the merger. My mother's signature was on the approvals. I sat there staring at the papers until my hands went cold. My husband and my mother had both been in on it. The marriage wasn't a business alliance. It was a heist. That night, I went home early. Daniel was sitting in the living room scrolling through his phone. I stood there for a moment, just watching him trying to see the man I had married. But all I saw was calculation. "When were you going to tell me?" I asked softly. He looked up, eyebrows raised. "Tell you what?" "That you and my mother used me to cover your tracks." He smirked, leaning back. "Vivian, you're too dramatic. It's called strategy." I took a step closer. "Strategy. You stole from her company." He laughed, a low, cruel sound. "You think that company was hers? It was already gone, sweetheart. She was desperate. I just gave her a way out. You were part of the deal." Something broke inside me at that moment, not a snap, but a quiet shattering. I walked out before he could see me cry. Over the next few weeks, I played my part perfectly. I smiled at events, nodded at meetings, kissed him on the cheek when the cameras flashed. But every night, I was collecting evidence. Bank statements, emails, transfers, every piece of proof that would eventually bring him down. I didn't tell my mother. Not yet. A part of me wanted her to realize what she had done on her own. But fate didn't give me that satisfaction. One morning, I got a call from her assistant. "Vivian, your mother collapsed in her office." She was gone before I reached the hospital. "Heart failure," they said. Too much stress, too many years of fighting battles she thought she could control. I sat by her bed, holding her cold hand, and whispered the words I had never said out loud. "You broke me, Mom, but I still loved you." After the funeral, Daniel pretended to be the grieving son-in-law. He stood beside me, hand on my shoulder, whispering condolences that made my skin crawl. But when the last guest left, he turned to me and said, "Now we can finally move forward." I stared at him hollow. "Forward. With everything, the company's in our name now. You'll thank me one day." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my mother's desk, surrounded by her files, her perfume still lingering in the air. I opened her last folder, one labeled Emergency Assets. Inside were letters she had written, but never sent. The first one began, "Vivian, if you're reading this, it means I've failed you." Her handwriting wavered, uncharacteristically fragile. She confessed that she had made a deal with the Aldens out of fear. She thought marrying me off would save me from losing everything. But Daniel had outsmarted her. He had already taken control of the company's assets behind her back. She realized it too late. Her final line broke me completely. "I built an empire to protect you, and in doing so, I destroyed the only thing that mattered, your trust." I cried until morning. The next day, I decided to finish what she started, but on my own terms. I called our lawyers. I played the grieving widow-to-be, telling them Daniel wanted full control, and that I needed legal guidance. Meanwhile, I sent every document I'd gathered to an investigative journalist I had met once at a charity event. I didn't care about the scandal anymore. I wanted the truth out. When the story broke, it was chaos. Headlines screamed, "Alden heir accused of corporate fraud and embezzlement." Daniel was furious. He stormed into the house, red-faced, shouting, "You did this!" he roared. I looked him in the eye for the first time in months. "You ruined my mother. You think I'd let you ruin me too." He grabbed my wrist, but I didn't flinch. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "No," I said quietly. "You will." Police came 2 days later. He was arrested for fraud, tax evasion, and forgery. Whitmore Interiors was seized for investigation, but the media sympathy turned public opinion in my favor. I wasn't the naive daughter or the complicit wife anymore. I was the woman who exposed two powerful families. And yet, even as I stood on the balcony watching the flashing lights fade, I didn't feel victory. I felt empty. My mother was gone, my marriage was ashes, and the company that defined our lives was in ruins. But maybe that was the only way to start over. That night, I poured a glass of wine and whispered to her photo. "You were wrong, Mom. Strength isn't about surviving the fire. It's about walking through it and still choosing to love what's left." The next morning, I went back to the office one last time. The employees stared at me like I was a ghost, but I smiled and told them to go home early. I stood in her corner office sunlight streaming across the empty desk and whispered, "It's over." But a part of me knew it wasn't. Because somewhere deep down, I could feel her presence, as if she was still watching, still trying to tell me something. And I was right. In the weeks that followed, I found myself haunted not by guilt, but by questions. Questions my mother's death had left unanswered. Who really destroyed Whitmore Interiors' Daniel or her own ambition? Was she a victim of manipulation or the architect of her own downfall? And why did she leave behind that one empty envelope in her emergency assets folder addressed to someone named R. Hayes? I couldn't stop thinking about it. The name wasn't familiar. I scoured the old directory's legal archives and her personal contacts, but found nothing. Then one night, while sorting through her office drawers, I found a worn, black notebook tucked inside a false bottom. My mother's handwriting filled every page, notes on projects, debts meetings, and one cryptic line written 3 times across the last page. "Find Robert before Daniel does." Robert R. Hayes. I didn't know it then, but that name would unravel everything I thought I knew about my family. After Daniel's arrest, the media frenzy faded. Reporters camped outside the gate for weeks, hungry for quotes. Friends I'd known for years stopped calling. They didn't know whether to pity me or fear me. I had become a cautionary tale, a woman whose marriage, family, and fortune collapsed all at once. But isolation can be a strange gift. When everyone abandons you, the silence becomes your teacher. I began to rebuild my life in fragments. I sold the mansion and moved into a modest apartment overlooking the city. I traded designer gowns for jeans boardrooms for quiet walks. For the first time in years, I could breathe without expectation pressing against my chest. Then one morning, as I was cleaning out boxes from my mother's estate, I found a faded business card inside a jewelry box. Robert Hayes, financial consultant. The address listed was a small office downtown. I didn't hesitate. When I arrived, the place looked abandoned, dusty blinds, a flickering fluorescent light, and a receptionist desk buried in unopened mail. I knocked on the office door, and a man in his 60s looked up from behind a stack of old ledgers. He had silver hair, deep lines around his eyes, and a weary kindness that immediately reminded me of my father. "Can I help you?" he asked. I handed him the card. "I'm Vivian Whitmore. My mother Eleanor had your name in her files." The moment I said her name, something in his expression shifted. He stood slowly, almost reverently. "Eleanor Whitmore," he murmured. "I haven't heard that name in years. Did you know her?" He gestured for me to sit. I did more than know her. I helped her start Whitmore Interiors. I blinked, stunned. "You worked for her!" He shook his head. "No, Vivian. I worked with her. In the beginning, before she built the company before your father." He hesitated, searching for the right word. "Before things changed." I leaned forward. "Then why did she write your name like it was a secret? Why did she tell herself to find you?" He sighed, pulling out a thin folder from an old file cabinet. "Because your mother and I shared one thing, something she never wanted anyone to know." He handed me a photograph, grainy black and white, taken decades ago. My mother stood beside him, smiling, holding a newborn baby. The breath caught in my throat. "That's me," he nodded. "Yes, and that's why she wanted you to find me." The room spun slightly. "What are you saying?" He looked at me with quiet sorrow. "Vivian, I'm your biological father." For a long time, I couldn't speak. My entire body went cold. My father, the man I mourned since childhood, wasn't my father at all. My mind raced back through the years, my mother's distance, her silence about their marriage, the way she'd never spoken about their life before I was born. I whispered, "You're lying." He didn't defend himself. He simply opened another folder, DNA documents, old birth certificates, financial transfers. The evidence was irrefutable. "She left me when you were a baby," he said softly. "I didn't fight it. She wanted power, and I was just a man with a conscience. But I followed your life from afar. When she married Richard Whitmore, I knew she'd finally gotten what she wanted, a name, a fortune, a legacy. But when I read about her death, I knew Daniel Alden had his hand in it. I warned her years ago that man was dangerous. My mind was reeling. The story I had believed my entire life, our family, our company, my mother's sacrifice, was a lie. I felt tears sting my eyes. "Why didn't you come back for me?" He looked down at his hands. "Because she told me not to. She said if I ever tried, she'd destroy me. And back then, she could have." I didn't know whether to hate her or mourn her all over again. He placed a small envelope on the table. "She sent this to me months before she died. She said if anything ever happened to her, I should give it to you." Inside was a single handwritten note in her elegant script. "Vivian, there are truths that can break you, but only the whole truth can set you free. Go to the lake house." The lake house? Our family's old retreat, abandoned for years after my father's death. I hadn't been there since I was a teenager. Robert offered to drive me, but I refused. I needed to do it alone. The next morning, I drove through the long, winding road leading to the lake. Autumn leaves carpeted the ground, and the house stood quiet under a canopy of orange light. I unlocked the door, and dust particles danced in the sunlight. Everything was exactly as we left it, furniture covered with white sheets, the faint scent of cedar still in the air. In her bedroom, I found a small chest under the bed. Inside were stacks of letters, photographs, and one old tape recorder. The label read, "For Vivian." My hands shook as I pressed play. "Vivian," her voice began soft-tired, unlike the commanding tone I'd always known. "If you're listening, I'm gone. There's so much I couldn't tell you while I was alive. I made choices I can't undo. I married your father for his name, not his heart. And when he died, I swore I'd never let you live the kind of helpless life I once had. That's why I built Whitmore Interiors. That's why I made you marry Daniel." Her breath trembled. But I didn't know the monster I was feeding. She paused, and I heard faint static before she continued. "Daniel didn't just want the company. He wanted revenge. His father and I, we had an affair long before you were born. He found out. He wanted to ruin me, and he used you to do it." I gasped aloud, nearly dropping the recorder. Daniel's father, Robert Alden Sr., had been her lover. Her voice cracked again. "He was the man who first invested in me. When I broke it off, he swore I'd pay. So when he proposed the merger years later, I was too desperate to refuse. I thought marrying you to Daniel would heal old wounds, not reopen them." She coughed softly, then whispered, "If I had been honest, maybe you would have loved me differently. But I was afraid of losing the one thing I had left your respect." The tape ended. I sat in that empty room for hours, staring at the recorder, feeling both fury and pity twist inside me. My entire life had been built on a foundation of secrets, an empire built on betrayal. When I finally stood, the lake outside shimmered under the afternoon sun. The reflection of the water was blinding, almost cleansing. For the first time, I didn't feel like my mother's daughter, or Daniel's wife, or a pawn in someone else's game. I was just me. That night, I burned the letters. Not out of hate, but release. Watching the paper curl into ash felt like exhaling after years of holding my breath. But closure, as I learned, doesn't come cleanly. The next morning, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost ignored it until the voice on the other end said, "Mrs. Alden, I think we should talk." It was a woman, calm, professional, but tense. "Who is this?" I asked. "My name is Charlotte. I used to work for your husband." Every muscle in my body went rigid. "What do you want?" She hesitated. "I think you should know that Daniel's case isn't over. He's cut a deal." My blood ran cold. "What kind of deal?" She lowered her voice. "He's offering evidence against you, claiming you were complicit in the fraud." I felt the world tilt again. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I know the truth," she said quietly. "And I have proof. Meet me tomorrow at the old courthouse on 5th Street, alone." The line went dead. I stood there for a long time, staring at the phone, my heart pounding. It felt like the ghosts of my mother and husband were reaching out from the past, pulling me back into the same web I'd tried so hard to escape. But this time, I wasn't running. This time, I was ready to fight. The next morning, the city felt heavier than usual, like the air itself carried secrets. I barely slept the night before, replaying Charlotte's words over and over. Daniel cutting a deal meant one thing: he was desperate. And when desperate men start talking, truth becomes currency. I arrived at the old courthouse early. The building was a relic, peeling paint-cracked windows, the faint smell of dust and time. Charlotte was waiting inside, sitting on a bench near the staircase. She was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with sharp eyes that had seen too much. "Vivian," she said softly when I approached. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I almost didn't." She nodded, glancing around nervously before handing me a small USB drive. "Everything on here proves what really happened. Daniel's father orchestrated the merger long before your mother thought she was in control. Daniel was just the executor." I frowned. Executor. Charlotte's jaw tightened. He was following his father's instructions. "Robert Alden Sr. wanted revenge for what your mother did decades ago. When she left him, he lost millions and his reputation. He used Daniel to rebuild his legacy and destroy hers. The fraud, the merger, it was all planned. Daniel was supposed to marry you, take over the company, then let it implode under your mother's name." My breath caught. "And my mother knew none of this." "She suspected," Charlotte said quietly. "But by the time she realized it, it was too late. Robert Sr. was dead, but his plan lived on through his son. And when your mother tried to back out, Daniel made sure she couldn't." I stared at her, my pulse pounding. "You mean he killed her?" Charlotte looked away. "I can't prove it. But I found something strange. A prescription bottle in your mother's name, filled by a pharmacy owned by one of Daniel's shell companies. Same week she died. My stomach twisted. I felt sick. All those years, my mother had been ruthless, manipulative, even cruel. But she hadn't deserved that." Charlotte looked back at me, her voice trembling. "He's trying to pin the entire financial collapse on you, Vivian. If he succeeds, you'll lose everything: your name, your freedom." I clenched my fists. "Why help me?" "Because I know what it's like to be used," she said simply. "Daniel ruined my career. I was his financial analyst. When I tried to expose him, he made sure I never worked again. This is my way of fighting back. I nodded slowly. Then we fight together. For the next week, we worked in secret. I contacted a lawyer. I trusted one who wasn't afraid of powerful names. Charlotte handed over files, hidden ledgers, and secret recordings. One of them made my blood run cold. Daniel's voice calm and calculated, saying, "If Vivian goes down with the company, no one will question her mother's death." It's poetic, really. Poetic. That word echoed in my mind like poison. We built a case piece by piece, but I knew the legal system wasn't enough. Men like Daniel always had a way of twisting the truth until it resembled virtue. So I decided to do what my mother never could: expose everything publicly. On a rainy Thursday morning, I walked into a news studio with Charlotte by my side. The anchor recognized me immediately, the fallen heiress, the scandal's tragic face. But this time, I wasn't here to be pitied. When the cameras rolled, I spoke. I was forced into a marriage to save my mother's company. I began, my voice steady. But that marriage was built on lies. My husband, Daniel Alden, didn't just steal money, he stole lives. My mother died believing she was saving me, when in truth, she was being buried by the same people she trusted. The anchor leaned forward. "Are you saying your husband is responsible for your mother's death?" I looked straight into the camera. "I'm saying my husband killed her spirit long before her heart gave out, and I have proof of what he did to our company. It's time the world knows." When the segment aired, it spread like wildfire. Every news outlet picked it up. Social media exploded. People who once avoided my name now couldn't stop saying it. Daniel's lawyers scrambled to issue statements denying everything. But denial doesn't erase evidence, and this time I had enough to bury him. 2 days later, federal investigators reopened his case. Charlotte and I handed over every file, every recording, every fraudulent transaction. It wasn't just fraud anymore, it was conspiracy, obstruction, and possibly murder. Then came the moment I didn't expect: a letter from Daniel. It arrived in a plain envelope, no return address, no signature, just a short note in his handwriting. "You think you've won, Vivian, but your mother lied to you about more than me. Look deeper. Not everything you inherited is yours to keep." At first, I thought it was just another manipulation tactic, a desperate man's last attempt to unsettle me. But something about the phrasing, the calm certainty, made me uneasy. That night, I reopened the box of my mother's files I had taken from the lake house. I went through every folder until I found one labeled Whitmore Investments, Private. Inside were property deeds, offshore accounts, and birth certificates. One of them wasn't mine. It was for a girl named Amelia Whitmore, born 2 years before me. Same mother. No father listed. My hands went numb. My mother had another child. I sat there staring at the paper, heart pounding. Why had she hidden this? Where was Amelia now? The next morning, I called Robert Hayes, my biological father. He sounded surprised but not confused when I mentioned the name. "Amelia," he repeated softly. "Eleanor told me about her once. She was your half-sister. She died when she was 5. Died." He sighed. "It was an accident. A fire at one of the first warehouses your mother built. But Eleanor never forgave herself. She said it was the price she paid for ambition." I didn't speak. The pieces of her life were rearranging themselves in front of me, forming a portrait of a woman driven not by greed, but by grief. Every cold decision, every sacrifice, every manipulation, it all came from one unbearable truth. She lost a daughter, and she refused to lose again. For the first time in years, I wept for her. Not as a victim or a villain, but as a mother who had been broken long before I was old enough to understand her. 3 months later, Daniel's trial began. The courtroom was packed journalists, buzzing like flies. When he walked in, handcuffed and unshaven, he still had that smug smirk, the kind that said he believed he'd find a way out. He didn't look at me until I took the stand. "Mrs. Alden," the prosecutor said, Do you believe your husband's actions led to your mother's death? I met Daniel's gaze, steady and unflinching. I don't believe it. I know it. He laughed under his breath, but his hands trembled. For the next 3 hours, I told the truth, every brutal, humiliating detail. The forced marriage, the fraud, the lies, the secrets. When I played the recording of his voice, his smirk vanished. When the verdict was finally read guilty on all counts, he stared at me one last time. There was no rage, no remorse, just exhaustion. "You're your mother's daughter," he said quietly as the guards led him away. For a long time, I didn't know whether that was an insult or a strange kind of respect. Maybe both. After the trial, Charlotte disappeared from the spotlight. She told me she was moving to Seattle, starting over. We promised to stay in touch, though. I think we both knew some wounds don't heal with friendship. They just fade quietly. As for me, I rebuilt Whitmore Interiors not as a monument to power, but as a foundation for something honest. I changed the name to Vivian & Co., focusing on ethical design and community projects. Small beginnings, but mine. Sometimes I still drive to the lake house. I sit by the water, where the ashes of my mother's letters once floated away, and I whisper things I never said when she was alive. "Mom, you were wrong," I tell her. Strength isn't control, it's forgiveness. The wind always picks up, then rustling the trees as if she's answering me. Maybe she is, because despite everything, her lies, Daniel's betrayal, the empire built on ashes, I learned the most painful truth of all. You can inherit a legacy of ruin and still choose to build something beautiful from it. It's been 3 years since the trial ended, and sometimes I still wake up expecting to hear my mother's heels clicking across the marble floor, or Daniel's voice echoing through the house, sharp and cold. But the only sound now is the wind outside my apartment window, and for the first time, that silence feels like peace. After everything that happened, I thought rebuilding would mean reclaiming what I'd lost. Instead, it meant learning to live without needing to. I spent months in therapy unraveling the knots of guilt and loyalty that had tied me to 2 people who defined my life. I told my therapist how I used to watch my mother from the staircase as a little girl, how she never looked back when she left the house in the mornings, too busy saving the empire she was building. How I once believed love was something you earned through obedience, through sacrifice. It took me 30 years to realize love isn't something to prove. It's something to receive and to give freely. Vivian & Co. grew slowly but honestly. I hired designers who believed in purpose over prestige. We worked with small families, not corporations. Every wall we painted, every home we restored, felt like stitching together pieces of my past, with gentleness instead of ambition. I even visited Robert Hayes again. He had aged more in 3 years than I remembered his health fading, but his eyes were soft when he saw me. "You remind me of her," he said, "but in all the ways she wanted to be." I asked him if he ever regretted not fighting for her. He smiled faintly. "Every day. But sometimes love isn't about holding on. It's about stepping back and letting someone destroy themselves if that's what they need to feel powerful." That stayed with me, because that's what my mother did too. She loved me by controlling me. She didn't know how else to love. And when she finally realized what that cost, it was too late. One afternoon, while reviewing paperwork in my office, I received a letter postmarked from a correctional facility. I almost threw it away, but the handwriting stopped me. It was Daniel's. I hesitated for hours before opening it. "Vivian, you can hate me forever, and I wouldn't blame you. I don't expect forgiveness, but you should know something. The day your mother died, she called me. She wanted to meet. She said she finally understood everything and wanted to make it right. I told her I'd come by the office. By the time I arrived, the ambulance was already there. I didn't kill her, Vivian, but I didn't save her either. And maybe that's the same thing. She was the only woman I ever loved because she was the only one who ever saw through me. And you? You were the only one who made me wish I could be better. I failed you both. Don't let her ghost define you the way it did me. Daniel. I sat there for a long time, the paper trembling in my hands. His words didn't excuse anything, but they pierced through something hardened in me. For the first time, I didn't see him as a monster. I saw him as what he truly was, a broken man, born from broken people, just like me. That night, I drove to the prison. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't go to yell or to forgive. I just needed to see the man who once held my entire life in his hands. They brought him into the visiting room in handcuffs. His hair was gray now, his eyes sunken, but when he saw me, he smiled a quiet, tired smile. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. "I didn't think I would either." We sat in silence for a moment before I asked, "Why did you write to me?" He shrugged. "Because I needed to tell you that I'm sorry. And because I know what it's like to be haunted by ghosts that won't let you move on." I looked at him for a long time. "You ruined my family." "I know." "And yet," I exhaled, "I don't want to carry you anymore." He met my gaze. "Then let me stay here. You walk free." Those were the last words we ever spoke. When I left the prison, the sky had turned pink over the horizon. It was one of those sunsets that looked like forgiveness, soft, hesitant, but real. Months passed, and I began writing a book. Not about revenge or betrayal, but about resilience, about what it means to survive the people who made you. I called it The Cost of Obedience. It wasn't a bestseller, but it found its audience, women who saw themselves in me, daughters who had been silenced by mothers who only knew how to love through control. One night, after a book signing, an older woman approached me, tears in her eyes. "Your story saved my daughter," she said. "I realized I was becoming your mother." I hugged her, and for the first time, I felt the weight of my pain transforming into something greater, something useful. Later, when I got home, I sat by the window with a cup of tea and thought about how strange life can be. How pain can destroy you or shape you depending on whether you hold on to it or let it breathe. I visited my mother's grave that weekend. The headstone was simple: Eleanor Whitmore, 1954-2021. Beneath it, I had engraved the words, "She built an empire and a daughter strong enough to survive it." I placed fresh lilies beside the stone and whispered, "I understand now," because I finally did. My mother wasn't my enemy. She was the mirror I had to shatter to see myself clearly. I turned to leave, but a gust of wind brushed against my cheek, gentle as a kiss. And in that moment, I felt her there, not the woman of ambition and iron, but the mother who once hummed lullabies to a child who would someday forgive her. When I got back to my car, I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes were my mother's. My strength was hers too. But the softness in them that belonged to me. That night, I opened my laptop and started a new project, a foundation in her name, supporting women trapped in toxic family dynamics, giving them legal aid and a way out. I wanted to turn all that inherited pain into protection for someone else. Maybe that was how generational curses truly ended, not with vengeance, but with compassion. I've learned that revenge feels powerful, but forgiveness feels infinite. It doesn't erase the scars, it teaches you how to live with them without letting them define you. My story began with a forced marriage and a crumbling empire. It ended with freedom, not from them, but from the version of myself they created. So if you're listening to this, If you've ever felt trapped by duty guilt or love that demanded too much, remember this. You don't owe anyone your silence. You don't have to destroy yourself to prove loyalty. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away and build your own name from the ruins of theirs. Because healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means finally being able to say their names without bleeding. If my story touched you, share it. Let others know that pain can become purpose and betrayal can give birth to rebirth. Tell me your thoughts below. I read every comment and I carry your voices with mine. And if you haven't already subscribed for more stories like this, stories that remind us that even in the darkest family secrets, light can still find its way through.